So as teachers engage with their students with these materials, and these materials, or various forms of them, were used widespread around the world actually for reading programs. They included the pupil readers, which was a compendium of different stories, and oftentimes a workbook type thing which included activities for the students, and a guide which would include sample questions or actually suggested questions for teachers to use. The readers were leveled. Sometimes they were thematically organized around a topic. It might be like a topic might be sea life or something like that. There was a carefully developed scope and sequence of skills to be taught at different levels across the grades, and which was fitted into the story itself. In other words, the skills that were taught were often related to the types of things that the story lent itself to. The dominant framework that was used all over the place was something referred to as a directed reading activity or directed reading lesson. And while there may be variations of this, this remains pretty well the dominant way of moving students through these selections. The class sometimes would be divided in accordance to the level of material that students could handle, and the famous three-group reading classroom was commonplace, but not necessarily just three groups. And the teacher would move the students through a selection. Before the reading of a selection, the teacher would initiate something to create interest. If the story's about parks, would talk about the parks and try to get students interested in the topic. Would introduce key concepts that might sort of serve as somewhat of an advanced organizer for what they might read. And it might be done hand in hand with introducing new vocabulary, which again the teacher would introduce with some interaction with the students en route to the teacher setting purposes. And the purposes were typically set for chunks of the text, which might initially be half a page, or 2 pages. In conjunction with those purposes that are set for those chunks, the teacher would respond with questions that the students would be expected to answer. After the reading of the selection in these chunks, there would be some post-reading activities which might involve some question and discussion about the whole story, maybe connections to other stories that they might read, so there might be recommended other readings. There would be related skill development. As I said, this might occur in conjunction with workbooks or worksheets, and it would involve the teacher showing the students what to do, and the students would work independently on some of the word recognition, comprehension skills or whatnot that were selected as a focus for this particular story. And there might be some formal sort of check or sort of mini tests that the teacher might use in conjunction with this activity. Now recall that in a lot of classrooms, reading is taught daily and for an hour and a half to 2 hours. Oftentimes these activities, particularly with the pupil engagement in the workbooks and stuff, would extend for several days, sometimes a whole week. And then they would move the next week on to the next story. Well, as I said, this was the emphasis through the 70s and 80s, and to some extent, people might say it still is what may be occurring in schools today. With the understandings that came out of the work on meaning making or constructivism or schema theory, there were shifts, however, in how we began to conceptualize this and how those folks who were working on reading programs began to suggest guidelines for teachers. One of the key things coming out of the meaning making was the emphasis upon that the students themselves are bringing meaning to the page. And the common adage that we followed relative to, or publishers followed and others relative to the pre-reading, was making sure that you were building bridges not to the students, from the students. In other words, the goal in the pre-reading was sort of saying, if you really want these students to be involved in meaning making, using their background knowledge, how do you get their ideas out there for them to build upon, for them to bring to bear on what they were reading, rather than the teacher telling the students, this is what they need to know to read this story, which is in a sense like building a bridge from the teacher or from the text to the child. What you'd be doing as a teacher was, trying to plan ways to connect with what the students already knew, ways to actually get the students' ideas on the table as the place to begin the lesson. So that was one shift that we definitely saw begin to occur here as a result of this emphasis upon meaning making. The other shift occurred also in conjunction with the guided reading. The research on meaning making made it really clear that what you're not wanting kids to do is to get a basket of ideas. What you're wanting students to do is to organize their knowledge and to have a sense of how ideas fit together. That when one brings a schema, they're bringing a schema, a sense of ideas and how they're connected. And so in the guided reading, the shift was, how do teachers begin to develop kids' understanding to be sure that you're actually developing a sense of coherence and a knowledge that is organized. Now, what's important here that this also was a way of dealing with some important research that had been done of teacher questioning. A fellow from Texas, Frank Gusak, had done a classic study of teacher questioning. And he found two things which has been found repeatedly in studies of teaching reading relative to teacher questions. One is that teachers tend to ask oftentimes fairly low-level question, as if they're checking to see if the kids have accurately read the text and can retrieve the information. So it's very text-based, teacher-driven. But he also found that when teachers asked a question, they'd get a response. They'd pretty well say if it's right or wrong, but then they'd move on to the next question. Then after that, they'd get a response and move on to the next question. It was like there was a question, response, new question, new response, new question, new response, rather than an attempt to build upon the students' responses. And so the shift here was an important shift from teacher-student response to teacher response in a way that expanded upon and started to pull the ideas together more in an organized fashion, whether it might be a story frame, if it's a narrative, or a different sort of way befitting an informational text. So that was another thing that began to happen as, in fact, we sort of shifted away from the 70s, 80s to this emphasis on bringing to bear this work from the meaning-making research and the metacognition research. And then in the post-reading, what also became a focus was a much more emphasis upon discussion, whereby the students aren't trying to guess what the teacher wants them to say or recall, but a discussion where the students' ideas are valued and extended and applied. And so my sense was that what we began to see occurring, and in some classrooms it already had been occurring in the hands of teachers who thought this way anyway, but we certainly saw a shift in the orientation as we move forward relative to these ideas. And in terms of related skills, it wasn't so much that we were interested in students engaging just in worksheets or activities. We began to ask ourselves, what are the strategies that are going to help students build bridges from themselves and their ideas to pull together coherent understandings? And how do we develop these reader-based and text-based strategies to the point to which students can use these beyond just the text they read? We could do the research, we could bring into bear the types of understandings we had from the learning to read research, but here we were beginning to ask this key question: are we really helping these students learn to learn, or are they simply having their ability to respond to us enhanced? And so there was a shift, I think, in terms of the focus here, a shift from the text and the teacher being the focus to the student being the focus. Now, I mentioned Frank Gusak's research, but probably one of the most profound and influential pieces of research was done by a person who was a colleague of mine at the time at the University of Illinois, and had an amazing research record. She had done some very important research on children who read early, but she set her mind on a research study which turned out to be a sort of a landmark study. Even though there were some debates about some of the elements of it, it was a very landmark study for what it found. It was a study by a woman by the name of Dolores Durkin, and it was an observational study of 3rd through 6th graders in which she was looking for the teaching of reading comprehension. In the article, she describes the type of explanations that she would consider counted as teaching reading comprehension, but she was interested in seeing if she could uncover in reading classes or social studies classes, or actually both of them, based upon her observations of what the activities were, what the teacher was doing, and what the students were doing, evidence of reading comprehension instruction. And reading comprehension instruction, from her perspective, wasn't to do with the teacher asking a question. Reading comprehension instruction was obvious explanations by a teacher together with student responses in an effort to enhance their understanding of how students might improve in terms of reading comprehension. She didn't go so far as to sort of assess it relative to whether or not it reached that threshold level of students being able to develop strategies to the point to which they could apply them to other text. She was just looking for instances of reading comprehension. What she found were very few instances of reading comprehension. She characterized what she saw as occurring in classroom as reading comprehension assessment. Not only in the reading classrooms, but in the social studies classrooms. That what teachers were doing was constantly assessing kids' reading comprehension, but doing very, very little to develop it. Now, the question she left us with, what was landmark about it, is we knew we were not teaching reading comprehension. We knew that what we were doing is putting kids through almost a form of procedural display of whether or not they comprehended something. But the question she left us with, which also the people who are doing the developmental psychologists like Anne Brown, Scott Paris, and John Bransford were beginning to ask us, is what does it mean? What should we do to help students learn to learn? What is it that we should be teaching, and how that will help students read with comprehension, but being able to do it for themselves in a range of different texts, flexibly and adaptively? You know, what does it take? I remember as I said, I was a colleague of Dolores, and she presented her research at a small seminar at the Center for the Study of Reading. And And everybody was sort of struck by how important that landmark research was. It's sort of basically sort of saying, hey, we really need to invest our energies in sort of looking at developing ways and making sure that we begin to research learning to learn. And Dolores talked about and showed instances of what she had found and how disappointed she was in the quality of what might be presented as reading comprehension instruction. But then when she went to present what she thought was an alternative, people were also disappointed in what she was presenting. And indeed, the fact that her own example was being criticized was not so much representative of a weakness with Dolores, but the state of the field. That we really, at this point in time, and I still think we may be lacking in many ways, we're not really sure of what we need to do to actually help students learn to learn.